All right, welcome back to another episode. If you see where we've left off from our previous episode here, we've got something that looks really remarkably close to the default calculator app that comes on iOS. So in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to continue this process of making it look and act more and more like the calculator app. Now, as a reminder, if you've been in a previous lesson, you didn't make it through Autolayout, for some reason things just aren't working out for you, it's okay. Just go ahead, clear out all your Autolayout constraints, pick one font size, work from that, and it's going to be okay. You can continue the entire tutorial without Autolayout playing nicely for you. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and jump in here. So what we're going to do first is we're going to update all of our buttons to make it so they actually display the correct thing. So if we just go ahead and double click in here, we can do plus and minus. We can type in X for multiply, and I can already tell that this is not what they use in the calculator app. They clearly have a multiply icon, and so we can resolve that later. But for simplicity and speed, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do this. Let's do division. I'm actually not sure how to do the division key on a keyboard. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead, we're going to open up Safari, and we're going to search for Unicode, divide, and this is going to give us the actual text symbol that we need here. We're going to just copy and paste it into our document. And this is a pretty common trick. If there's a character that does exist and you just don't know how to type it on your keyboard, you just search for Unicode and it will give you the thing that you can copy and paste. So let's paste that in there. And we're actually going to do the same thing for the plus minus symbol because I don't know how to type that on a keyboard either. All right, again, like this is not the same as what they've got in the calculator app, but this is close enough for what we want right now. We can replace these with real icons later. We can do %, capital C, 7, do 8 and 9, and 4, and we'll click in here, and 5, 6, double click in here, and 1, and 2, and 3. All right, so now what we've got is something that's already looking a lot more like a calculator. It's got our plus minus, our clear button, all of our multiplication, division, everything like that, and our numbers. It's looking really good. It's looking a lot like the default calculator app, minus a few custom icons. So now let's go ahead and let's make these buttons actually function. We've made buttons function in the past. Let's go ahead and wire these up to some code that we're going to write. So if we come up here and we open our left panel, which is our navigator, and we go back over to viewcontroller.swift, we already have a lot of code here. Let's go ahead and close this right panel. It's useful for storyboards, but it's not going to be useful in here. We're going to clean up some of this code. We actually don't need all this. So our old code about adding numbers, we can go ahead and get rid of. Our function that we wrote, we don't need. We're going to be writing some new functions so we can get rid of these examples. We're going to clean up our view.did_load, and we're going to get rid of this variable that we're not going to be using right now. So now we have something that looks really close to what the template gave us, but we have this add button, or this button tapped function that we're going to change into an add button tapped function. And this is what will get called when they tap the add button. And we're going to do the same thing for subtract. And we can even select everything by holding shift and pressing the arrow keys to select more. We're holding shift and clicking, and we're going to go ahead and copy and paste and change this multiply and divide. I'm going to do equals. All right, so that's all of the orange buttons there on the right-hand side. So now we're going to go across the top. We're going to do the % button. We're going to go ahead and do our plus minus button. We're going to do our clear button. And then finally our decimal button there at the bottom. Now all of these are the arithmetic operators that we have. So none of the numbers, just the arithmetic. So if you remember how to make a comment, we're going to come up here and we're going to put in a comment that actually indicates that, hey, everything under this line are the arithmetic buttons. So we can have like a nice organizational line here. So when we're reading our code, we can say, oh yeah, all these functions down here, these are for arithmetic functions. And then the other thing we're going to do is we're going to create another comment up above, and this is going to be for our number buttons. Okay, so if you've probably guessed, we're going to go ahead and we're going to just copy and paste. We're going to do the same thing, and we're just going to create a function for every single number button. So let's make one for 0 and 1 and 2, 3, a little repetitive, but I want to make sure you have time to type it yourself, 4, 5. Also, you get the benefit of learning through repetition here, so a little muscle memory building up for you, get you familiar with all of these keywords and how to write functions. And 8. And finally, do the number 9 tapped. All right, so now we have a function for every single button in our calculator app. That should feel pretty good. We've actually written a huge chunk of the code that we're going to need. So let's go ahead and make our view, so all of our buttons that are in our view, tie up to the code that we've just written. You can see our view controller class that we have written back here correlates to the view controller here at the top of the header. We're going to go ahead and control click on this or right click on it and pull up this menu. And you can see this looks different from previous lessons, and that's because we've added all of these functions for our buttons to tie into. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to drag over the add to the TouchUp inside. We're going to do this for every single one of them. Clear button to TouchUp inside. The decimal, TouchUp inside. Again, this is a little repetitive, but this will hopefully help you build some muscle memory, get comfortable with the UI of building something in a storyboard here. While we're doing this, here's a little fun trivia for you. So our IB actions that we've been creating in the code file that ties all these together, the IB stands for Interface Builder. And so that's what this storyboard editor is called. It's called Interface Builder, and it's because we're building the user interface. So it's kind of a fun little fact. And the other is that you already know this if you listened to the previous lessons, but the reason we're attaching these to TouchUp inside, which is the event we want for our buttons, TouchUp inside makes it so that if you put your finger down and then you don't lift up your finger inside the button, it will actually cancel pressing the button. So let's say that you started to hit multiply and you didn't want multiply. You can actually pull your finger away from multiply and then lift up, and it will cancel pressing the button, which is a really nice feature for users so they can feel confident that, even if they make a mistake, they have a way to get out of it. All right, I'm going to do 6. I'm going to do minus our subtract button. Get our 3, almost done here. 2, and finally our 0 button. Now, the great thing is here, we've got all of these buttons wired up to things, and you can see that as we mouse over, it actually highlights which button. So if you want to be really thorough, you can kind of go through and make sure that every button has the opportunity to highlight. One thing you should be making sure is that every single one of these says touch up inside. So they're wired up to the right action. And if we close this and we go back over to our view controller, you can even verify over here by checking and making sure that every single function has a little dot. So that means that at least from that direction, each function is at least tied to some button. So that's looking pretty good. That's a good place for us. So let's go ahead and make these buttons actually do something when you tap them. So let's start with the buttons that actually are used for entering numbers. Those are the easiest ones. They don't require any special math. We're just typing in some numbers here. Now, when you type on a calculator, it doesn't replace the number. It has this sort of additive effect where like the number grows and gets longer. And so what we want is we actually want a variable similar to how we had in our previous lesson so that we can continuously grow or add on to this number that the user's typing in and save it for the entire time. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a var, and we're going to name our variable user input. And this is going to be our number that the user typed in. And we're going to put a colon here, and we're going to call this is going to be a double, which is, so remember, it's a number that supports decimal places. And we're going to assign that to 0 to start because the user hasn't actually typed anything in yet. So what we can do here is we go back to our 0 button function, and we can say self. Now, self is something we haven't talked about before, but it's a way of referring to the object that you are in. So in this case, we are inside a view controller. And you can see because of the curly braces that we're inside the scope of view controller. This function is a function that belongs to view controller. So self will correspond to our view controller class. Now, you don't need to put this. It's just useful for clarifying. And because the 0 button tapped function belongs to view controller, it can infer that the user input variable that we're talking about is the one that lives in the same scope as this function. So we can go ahead and we can do user input equals 0, user input equals 1, or you can do self.user input equals 0, self.user input equals 1. And we'll talk about that in a second. There is some value to using self, but just to show you how this can work, just cruise right along here. Make it so after you click a button, the user input gets set to the corresponding number. So 7, and 8, and 9. Okay, so if we go ahead and we're going to run our app here, you're going to see that all of the buttons should be laid out properly, and we can click on them. They even do a little highlight animation to indicate that they're being tapped on. But we actually don't have any way of being able to tell if our code is actually doing anything. Now, we obviously have lots of indications, but we would like something, so let's maybe make it so that it prints to the console down here. So let's go ahead and make a function, and this is going to be called show user input. And what this is going to do is it's going to make it so that whatever we type in, it displays it to the user. Now, a quick and easy way just to make sure that this is working properly is to just have it call print. And we're going to print out the user input. So that'll be a great start for us. Make it print to the console. That's a good way to show the user input. Now, with functions as well as variables, you can use self to refer to another function within the same scope. So in this case, you can either do show user input or self.show user input. Now let me show you why you could have issues here. So if we create a variable called user input inside this function, you might think, oh, geez, look at that. The color changed, and it's because even Xcode is saying, well, look here, you have 2 user inputs, and I've got to pick one. And so it picks the one that's closest to it in scope. And so what the self does, if we want to refer to the variable that is on our view controller and not the variable that's in our function, we can do self.userInput. And you can see how it turned back to green again. It has figured out, oh, not this variable that's here that's local to this function. We want the variable that's on our view controller. And you can do the same thing. The thing is you very rarely are going to have functions inside of functions. So, you know, the self dot is maybe slightly less useful for the function show user input, but we're going to go ahead and do it anyway. We're going to put self dot in front of all of these just to make it consistent. And there's a whole category of bugs that you're going to avoid later down the road if you just get in the habit of putting self dot in front of your variables and functions that are belonging to the class that you're in. It might seem silly now, but once you start getting really long functions with lots of variable names and stuff, it's pretty easy to accidentally refer to the wrong one. So we're just going to go ahead and do that. It's a good practice. Like I said, you don't have to do it, and there's tons of people that don't, but we're going to do it here, get you familiar with it. All right, let's hit run. You can see we go ahead and we click the buttons, and as we click the buttons, it goes ahead and it prints out every single number that we programmed it to type in. Now, obviously, the arithmetic buttons aren't doing anything yet. We haven't created anything for the arithmetic buttons, and that's fine. The problem is, though, is that the user is not going to have access to the console when they're using our app on their phone. So it'd be nice if the label up there at the top actually, instead of just saying label, said what the user typed in. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another variable that's going to be our user input label. And just the same way that we've done in the past, we're going to tell it what type this label is. And this is something that you wouldn't know otherwise, but it's called a UI label, similar to how we're using UI kit and we're inside a UI view controller. We're using UI label. That's just the name of the class that Apple provides for drawing text onto the screen. And now we talked about optionals in the past, and this is actually going to be optional. But in this case, we know that by the time our code gets to us, we will have a label. And this might seem weird, but the storyboard doesn't represent code, which means that when this is compiled, it won't actually know what the label is. But once the app is running, it is able to pull all the information for our view out of the storyboard, and the label will no longer be optional, it'll no longer be nil. So what we're going to do is we put this exclamation mark to indicate that this is optional, but we know for a fact that by the time it gets to us, it won't be nil. And you can contrast that to the question mark that we used in our previous lesson. Now, the other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to use @IB outlet. IB outlet is the counterpart to IB action. This is an interface builder outlet, and this lets us connect the label to the variable rather than connecting an action. So like a button tap would be an action, whereas if we wanted the button itself, or in this case, the label, rather than an action it can perform, we use IB outlet. And so if we come back over to our storyboard and we click on our view controller, you'll see that we have all of our stuff still wired up to our functions, our IB actions. But up here in the top part under outlets, we actually have this new one, user input label, which is the one we just created. So if we drag this over to our label, it highlights, it connects it. And if we hop back over to our code, you can even see that the little circle is highlighted the same way to indicate that it's been wired up. And so now when the app is run and our view did load is called, at the point that our view is loaded, we will have a label, even though at the time our app is being compiled, it doesn't have it. So it's kind of a cool way to see optionals in action, but not actually have to do much with them. We can just trust that the way Apple has built everything means that we won't have a nil instead of a label. We'll actually have a label. So let's go ahead and change show user input here. And we're going to take our label instead of using print, and we're going to update the text on it. Now the text is just a variable that user input label has, and we could assign it to whatever. But in this case, we're going to use a special way of turning a variable into a string of text. So we do this / open close parenthesis. Make sure your slash is going the right direction. And we're going to put self.userInput. And we can use this same syntax to say like user typed. And you'll see what happens here. We run it. It starts out as label again, which is what we have in our storyboard. And when you click on one of these numbers, instead of printing to the console, it changes it to user typed. And it kind of gets clipped there because it's too big. Let's get rid of that. And you can see again starts as label. We click on a number and boom, it actually changes to the number that we just tapped. Now, as we talked about, that's not exactly the behavior we want. A calculator, the number sort of grows as you type these. It's appending them to the end. But this is a good place for us to start here. We've got all of our buttons actually wired up to code. We've got our label wired up to code so that we can change what it displays and give some feedback to the user. And we've got our numbers actually being saved to a variable. So in the next episode, we're going to take this one step farther. We're going to make it so that you actually are appending the numbers in the way that you would expect to the end of your number. And that will set us up so that we can do arithmetic. And after the arithmetic, we'll actually be finished with our calculator app. So we're close to the finish line here. Great job. Again, if you have any questions, you have any problems, leave them in the comments below. I'll be happy to reach back out to you guys and help answer any questions you have. and we'll catch you on the next video. Thanks for watching.